The Taliban and US meet face-to-face as Afghanistan endures one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Afghan funds in the West remain frozen, while repression of women and rights abuses continue. Will the talks bring Afghans some hope? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. High-level discussions between Taliban leaders and US officials have taken place here in Doha. It's the first time that the two sides have met directly since the group retook control in Afghanistan 2 years ago, when NATO forces withdrew after 20 years of conflict. All the business happened behind closed doors, and little's being said by either side, apart from brief statements published online. A spokesman for the Afghan Foreign Affairs Ministry posted on social media said the delegations discussed confidence building, practical steps towards removing blacklists and lifting sanctions. They also spoke about the unfreezing of Afghan central bank reserves, economic stability, countering narcotics, and human rights. He added that both the US and the Taliban government emphasized the continuation of such meetings, understanding, and interactions. The US State Department, for its part, has issued a statement saying that it would be open to a technical dialogue regarding economic stabilization issues soon. It's also open to continuing dialogue on counter-narcotics, saying it recognized a significant decrease in the cultivation of poppies. But the US has expressed deep concern about the humanitarian crisis and the need to continue to support aid organizations and UN bodies delivering assistance. Well, before we go to our guests, let's recap how we got here. The Taliban swept to power in Afghanistan in August 2021. The US had already announced that it was leaving, ending almost 20 years of military action by a NATO multinational force, which invaded after the 9/11 attacks. The Taliban inherited a country struggling with war, corruption, and armed groups. Despite early promises not to return to the oppressive policies imposed in 2001, restrictions on women returned, with bans on working and girls' secondary education. The United Nations says that around 97% of Afghans live in poverty. 28 million need aid just to survive this year. Most humanitarian organizations have suspended their operations, and the US still holds about $7 billion of Afghan central bank assets, which have been frozen for the past 2 years. We did reach out to the Taliban for a spokesman to join our discussion, but no one was available. So let's bring in our guests. From Kabul, we're joined by Mahbouba Seraj, Executive Director of the Afghan Women's Skills Development Center and a board member of the Afghan Women's Network. From Oxford, Timor, Sharan, author of Inside Afghanistan and Executive Director of the think tank Afghanistan Policy Lab. And from Belfast, Michael Semple, Visiting Research Professor at Queen's University, Belfast, and former Deputy EU Special Representative to Afghanistan. A warm welcome to you all. Mahbouba, let's start with you if we can. So we've had these talks between the US and the Taliban, the first face-to-face in quite some time. Is there anything about that that would give people who continue to suffer in Afghanistan hope that their circumstances could change?
Thank you very much for having me on your show. Thanks a lot. You know, this is one of the it's one of the hopes of Afghanistan. We are really praying for something like this, that it would be, you know, for the benefit, to the benefit of the Afghan people, really. But whether it is or not, it's not very clear. It's been quite some time that the United States, I know, since they had a talk with the Taliban. So it was kind of overdue. And the Taliban really were the only country in the world that they would like to have a talk with is the United States. For some reason, the rest of the world really does not matter so much with the Taliban. But with the US, they love to talk. So this could be pretty, you know, interesting and maybe good and to the benefit of the Taliban for sure. Whether it's going to be good for the benefit of the people of Afghanistan, that's an entirely separate, different question. Because we really don't know what is actually going on behind the scenes between United States and the Taliban. there is something going on which is very different from what is going on between Taliban and the rest of the world and the people of Afghanistan. So as long as that is not clear to us, it's a bit hard for us to really know what this is all about. Is there going to be, there's going to be any gains or is not? Because the Taliban did not even mention that they talked about the women or the women's rights or the human rights. Nothing. The Taliban did not even mention. And that was not really interesting for them at all. So let's see what the Americans.
What do you mean when you say that there's something entirely different going on between the Taliban and the people of Afghanistan and the face to which the Taliban presents to the world?
Oh yeah, there is definitely like that, because you know the Taliban actually won a war from the world, and mainly from the ones that they count that they won the war from as the United States. For them, that is extremely important. And so far, they haven't been acknowledged by the ones that they won the war from, you know, to say that, okay, you know, you won this war. And they never had a talk about it or whatever. Only thing that they have heard is always, you know, as far as they're concerned, negativity, you know, towards the things that they're doing, because they're doing it. It's not that this is, you know, something that there are stories being told about. No. The women of Afghanistan, they really are in a very bad place still. So this is what is actually going on, that we, you know, the rest of the world does not really know, because no matter how much the world wanted to talk to them, the EU talks to them, the, you know, other countries of the world talks to them, and all of the humanitarian help is there, all of the UN, the UNAMA, all of that. For the Taliban, the most important is that they really would like to sit down and talk to the Americans. So that means that there is something going on that these two really understand what on earth is that, and they really would like to talk about it.
All right.
So that's my take.
Timor, does the US really have any leverage over the Taliban? Are these talks going to achieve anything, do you think? Will they ultimately lead to persuading the Taliban to reverse policies that are making life so intolerable for people in the country?
It's a very good question. I agree. It's we're not sure with Mahbouba Seraj here that we're not. I'm not certain how this talks will help Afghan people. But what is clear is that the U.S. really doesn't have a lot of leverage here. The leverage it had, it has already used around sanctions. It has already imposed sanctions on Afghanistan and the Taliban leadership. It really doesn't have a lot of leverage at the moment on the core Taliban leadership in Kandahar that are making decisions. But again, let me go back. What is this administration, the current US administration's thinking? What we know is President Biden has been very clear about his thinking on Afghanistan and Afghan people. He has clearly said, summed it up, it's not a country. Its people seem to have an aspiration. It's divided, it's tribal. Therefore, it doesn't really seem that it's a priority for US and US foreign policy. Now, what it has focused so far, what are the key US interests here? And what is US focusing on? First of all, counterterrorism. It has focused on counterterrorism and trying to limit international terrorism operations inside Afghanistan. That threatens its interest around the world. The second focus has been around evacuation of the remaining Afghans who have worked with the U.S., especially in light of the upcoming presidential elections and the fact that the Republicans are trying to portray Biden administration's effort towards evacuation in August 2021 as messy and incompetent. And I guess the most important point here is the hostages that the Taliban, the U.S. hostages that the Taliban have in captivity. We know that hostage diplomacy is a significant factor in Washington, D.C. We know that historically it has taken a lot of attention and a lot of bandwidth at the highest level from administration. It has shaped the perception of competence of an administration. So I think the timing around the current talk, to me, sounds very much around the latter factor, those factors that I mentioned, in particular the hostage diplomacy, and focusing on technical issues and economic stabilization essentially means to me throwing carrots at the Taliban.
Is the Taliban, or rather is the US talking to the right people in the Taliban? The people that it... Oh, right, okay.
No, clearly they're not. I mean, there seems to be this perception that by engaging with pragmatists, again, not moderates, pragmatists, I don't believe there is such a thing as moderate Taliban. I think they are all, it's a fundamentalist group on a clear mission to fundamentally transform Afghan society and polity and beyond Afghanistan. But the pragmatists, that people like Muttaqi and others in Kabul, the US have been engaging with them for the past 4 years during Doha talks and in the last 2 years. None of those conversations, back-channel contacts have produced result. Clearly, they're not talking to the right people. And let me mention that the Taliban are aware that the US does not consider Afghanistan a key priority. They understand that. And I think they're trying also to gain maximum leverage from what they have, the hostages that it keeps, the entire Afghan population, as they have kept hostage, slowing down the evacuation process, and more importantly, putting half of the population essentially in prison and pursuing a gender appetite policy in Afghanistan.
Okay, let's bring in Michael. Michael, what do you make of the talks? Is now the right time to be talking to the Taliban? To what extent is the US sincere in its aims regarding the Taliban? Is it perhaps talking more with its own interests in mind than those of the Afghan people?
Well, I think the US has had quite a explicit policy since the Taliban takeover of being prepared to engage in dialogue with the Taliban to achieve US interests. I mean, that really has been constant over the past 2 years. If there have been periods when there have been gaps in that, if there have been gaps in that, it has been because the Taliban have engaged in actions which have been just so difficult for international actors to stomach that it's become politically impossible for the US to continue the engagement. So they go through pauses. Obviously, if they, when the Taliban banned girls' secondary education, banned women working for aid agencies, there was going to be a gap. The US has returned to the table, but I think that Timor is absolutely right with extremely limited objectives there, like getting people out of Taliban jails. And I think that the Taliban have become past masters at exploiting the opacity around talks like this to pretend that they are able to achieve much more than is even on the table. So, for example, a Taliban statement saying that they've raised the issues of blacklists and sanctions. Well, maybe they've mentioned, but it's absolutely inconceivable that they can make progress on that with the current state of affairs. What the Taliban are doing, we know that for the past 2 years, the Taliban have hoped to win international recognition. Well, it's not just the US who are looking at how to talk with the Taliban. The broader international community, with some now helped by a UN special coordinator, have been addressing this. And frankly, international recognition is just not on the agenda now. The Taliban are just so far away from achieving that because they consistently have said, yeah, we'll talk and we'll never compromise.
Michael, is the Taliban toying with the US and the wider international community? Are they sincere when they sit down for talks, do you think?
Well, I mean, some of the feedback we got from Taliban negotiators in terms of their lessons learned in dealing with the US and Afghans in negotiations was our approach to negotiations is we state our demands and we wait for the other side to concede. That's their approach. You can call that sincere if you like. As far as they're concerned, it's worked so far. But I think that at best they'll be able to have a limited transactional relationship and no progress on big issues like international recognition or removing sanctions or essentially bringing Afghanistan under the Taliban back into the international fold. Now, remember, one thing which neither side has mentioned on this, because frankly, I mean, the Taliban have more or less ruled it out, is the issue of return to an inclusive political system and an accountable government inside Afghanistan. Now, successive UN Security Council resolutions have called for that. Broadly, people seem to think if you want an end to conflict in Afghanistan, you're going to have a return to an inclusive political system. The Taliban basically, over having gone through the Doha talks to get the US forces out of the country, promising that they would move towards that, for the past 2 years have essentially ruled it out, or at most they've claimed because we have one or two Tajiks and Uzbeks in our government, and of course Tajik Taliban, Uzbek Taliban in our government, we have an inclusive administration, forgetting about women and essentially not having any representative members of the ethnic communities in Afghanistan. They haven't put this on the agenda.
Mahbouba, we talked about the terrible humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. Are sanctions making things worse for the people of Afghanistan? You talked about the terrible toll that's been taken on women and girls. There are reports of a dramatic increase in the rates of suicide among Afghan women and girls. Exact numbers are difficult to come by, of course, because the Taliban suppresses reporting of such deaths. But to what extent are Western sanctions making the stress that women and girls in particular are suffering even worse? Is morally now the right time to start talking about the lifting of sanctions and providing further economic aid to Afghanistan?
Well, the sanctions, the effect of sanctions on the people of Afghanistan, and especially on the women, has been absolutely, unbelievable. And the reason is that because, the women's situation in Afghanistan right now has become so politicized that they are, all of the religion and everything else is completely out of the picture. It's nothing to do with anything. The women are being so used as a political weapon. So they are playing with this. They're playing anytime when there is a sanction or something that the Taliban don't like, Taliban are taking it out on the women of Afghanistan. And this way, the losers are really the people of Afghanistan, the women of Afghanistan, the poor of this country, and the children of this country. They are the ones that are actually the losers. Whether the help of the world continues or doesn't continue, it depends on how much the world really would like to help Afghanistan or not. We can all die, or maybe a part of us will die, because so far the only thing that, thank God, we don't have in Afghanistan, we don't have a lack of food commodities in the country. We have food, we have enough food. The only thing is that people don't have any money to buy it, and that's difficult. But I'm sure there's going to be a time when we won't have that either. Then what are we going to do? So this whole thing is becoming extremely political. And now you also mentioned something about these people being the hostages. What hostages? Who has taken whom hostage? Why is all of this coming up? This is what I'm saying, that there's so much going on that the people of Afghanistan are not aware of it. It's just that the world, most probably the US is aware of it, and maybe the Great Britain, and that's about it. Not everybody else knows. So what is this hostage situation? Which hostage? Who is the hostage? And how many are they? And how come this became so important after 2 years? What on earth is going on? So these are the things that the people of Afghanistan are absolutely not aware of. Okay. So that's why we do believe that there are two levels of lies going on. One side is one kind of a lie, and the other side is another kind of a lie. One lie is between the Taliban and the US government, that they're doing whatever it is that has been going on. Okay. The other side is the lie between US, Taliban, and the people of Afghanistan. That Timor, they don't absolutely have no idea.
Timor, I'll come back to you in just a moment, but I want to get Michael's opinion on what Mahbouba was saying there.
Yeah, it's very interesting that obviously Mahbouba has brought up again the issue of opacity. I'd like to touch on two of these issues. First one on the issue of continuation of assistance. I think it's remarkable, given given that the Taliban completely defied the international community and in fact defied the Qatari government to insist on taking power by force rather than proceeding with a political agreement which was available to them in Qatar. Given that the very difficult circumstances in which they came to power, I think it is remarkable that humanitarian assistance provided by the international community has continued at the level it has. Currently, the Afghan economy is around between $12 and $15 billion per year. Currently, $3 billion are being provided to Afghanistan in international humanitarian assistance. Still, despite all the bad blood, despite all the difficult relations between the Taliban and the rest of the world, between a quarter and a fifth of Afghanistan's national income comes from international humanitarian assistance. Currently, that is at jeopardy, not because of sanctions. The international actors have found ways around the sanctions to allow the continuation of that humanitarian assistance, to help the Afghan people, not to help the Taliban administration. But the Taliban administration has consistently been interfering in the process of delivering assistance, which I'm sure that Mahbouba is well aware of, because she's in the very difficult business of trying to run NGOs in the current circumstances. Taliban are basically trying to take over organizations, to insist that only Taliban-approved, registered, and controlled organizations are able to work in subcontracting, and the successive levels of interference are either jeopardizing the continuation of the assistance process. The very act of banning women from working in assistance organizations and even in the UN was something which jeopardized the delivery of humanitarian assistance. So I would say, actually, it's whether the Taliban are prepared to show some respect for international norms in dealing with their own people, and with the aid agencies will determine whether it is possible to continue delivering assistance. On the issue of secret diplomacy and hostages, I'm very glad that Mahbouba raised this, because I'm absolutely certain that the Afghan population has got little sight of this. But I think we must make a clear distinction between the role of the Western countries who are trying to recover their citizens who have been held hostage by the Taliban, and the role of the Taliban. As Timor mentioned earlier on, in the US, in the UK, and in the EU, governments have an obligation to their own citizens, and when citizens are held hostage abroad, governments basically have to do everything they can to secure their release and bring them home. The Taliban has held a series of people who have been aid workers, private citizens, all sorts of people who wash up in Afghanistan. Some people I would strongly advise them not to be in Afghanistan unless they've got extremely good business to be there. But the Taliban has seen fit to hold them. There's either no due process or a fiction of due process, and the Taliban is quite explicitly trying to extricate concessions from those governments. Okay. This is hostage diplomacy. The Taliban are not the only administration around the world which engages in this, but I would say no responsible government ever does it. It's got nothing to do with the Afghan people whatsoever. It is the Taliban trying to find leverage over international players and extract things like guarantees of non-cooperation with the Afghan resistance.
Timor, there's a lot for you there to come back on if you wish to, and I also want to know where you stand on the issue of sanctions. Are they useful? Is now the time to lift them?
Well, sanctions are terrible, and it does impact ordinary people. And historically, sanctions have not necessarily been the most useful tools. But having said that, let me echo what Michael said, that the suffering of Afghans is not the result of simply the sanctions, but the policies that the Taliban have pursued over the last 2 years, repression and brutality of their policies towards Afghan women, and some other policies that they have taken. It has made it impossible for international community, including US, not to show to its domestic constituency that it is taking a sanction. And sanctions are often the easiest steps to take. Having said that, again, it's important to note that the US sanction has produced a number of exemptions, and those are around humanitarian aid delivery. So a humanitarian aid delivery is exempt from including NGOs and other organizations that are operating in Afghanistan are exempt from those sanctions, and that is why the current international aid response is working in Afghanistan. Let me echo that it's important that we alleviate the suffering of Afghan people, and I do believe that international aid must continue in Afghanistan for Afghan people and must be delivered, given in light of the current crisis that 2/3 of Afghan population are in need of humanitarian assistance. But having said that, we should not continue with the policy of appeasement. It hasn't worked. Appeasement towards the Taliban. They've been very shrewd and smart in when it comes to negotiation, as Michael pointed out. And finally, the suffering of Afghan women in particular is the result of the fact that this is a fundamentalist organization. It's a movement that is built on fundamental mission to completely transform Afghan society and polity in Afghanistan and beyond. And they are on a God-given mission to transform that society. Look at the latest UN report that was prepared for UN Security Council. It clearly highlights the worsening of the presence and expansion of various international terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And this entity is a ticking bomb where I stand. Yeah. It's just a matter of time before the Taliban produces another 9/11 in different parts of the world. And they are, the international terrorist organizations, you look at TTP in Pakistan, are expanding rapidly.
Mahbouba, I have a feeling we're going to be giving you the last word here in the few minutes remaining. But picking up from what Timor was saying there about the worsening humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, the rights of women and girls ignored, women continuing to suffer repression, and that of course worsens the already extreme poverty in Afghanistan and the dire economic situation in the country, because 50% of the population can't add anything economically. What should the US and the international community be doing right now other than what appears to be wringing their hands over Afghanistan and the Taliban? What's the solution? Yeah,
you're absolutely right. That's all I've really actually seen is wringing their hands. And I'm really tired of this, you know. Decisions were made, decisions were taken, they were put into action, and the results of it is one disaster after another, after another, after another.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we are out of time. I really appreciate you all being on the programme today, Mahbouba, Seraj, Timor, Sharan, and Michael Semple. As always, thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.